Hello, and welcome back to The Sleepless Storyteller, where the fire burns low, the night grows quiet, and history unfolds one gentle story at a time. I'm glad you're here tonight, so settle into your pillow, let your shoulders relax, and leave the worries of today behind. Tonight, we're stepping aboard a small wooden ship bound for the unknown. The year is 1492. The ocean stretches endlessly in every direction. The deck creaks beneath your feet. The salty wind fills the sails, and home is already far beyond the horizon. Life at sea was cramped, uncomfortable, and far more dangerous than most of us could imagine. Tonight, we'll discover why life aboard Christopher Columbus's ship was a journey that few of us would be prepared to survive. Before we set sail, if these quiet journeys through history help you relax, I'd love for you to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell. It helps the sleepless storyteller reach others looking for a peaceful story at the end of the day. Now, get comfortable and let the story begin. Why you wouldn't survive aboard Christopher Columbus's ship. Brutal story of the man who sailed off the edge of the known world. A ship with no land in any direction. Picture the deck of a small wooden ship somewhere in the middle of an ocean that, as far as its crew could tell, might not have another side at all. It is October of 1492. For 36 days now, 3 ships have been sailing due west, further from home than any of these sailors have ever traveled, further than most of them ever intended to travel when they signed on for what they'd been told was a relatively short, well-paid voyage. The food is beginning to spoil. The water is starting to taste to the barrels it's been stored in for over a month. And every single day, from sunrise to sunset, the horizon offers exactly the same thing it offered the day before: water, and more water, in every direction, with no hint of the land their captain has promised them lies just ahead. Below deck, in low voices that their captain is not meant to hear, some of these men have begun discussing an idea that would have been unthinkable back in the harbor at Palos, when this whole voyage still felt like an adventure rather than a slow, creeping catastrophe. They have begun discussing whether it might be time to simply throw their captain overboard, turn the ships around, and sail home while there is still enough food and water left to make the return journey survivable at all. The man they are discussing throwing overboard is a Genoese wool weaver's son turned obsessive, self-taught navigator, a man who spent nearly a decade being rejected, mocked, and dismissed by nearly every royal court in Europe before finally convincing one desperate, recently victorious queen to gamble on his impossible idea. His name is Christopher Columbus, and within the space of just a few more days, he is about to become one of the most consequential human beings in the entire history of the world. Not because his idea was correct, which it largely wasn't, but because of what his stubborn, reckless persistence was about to set in motion for millions of people on both sides of an ocean. He was, at this very moment, still not entirely sure he would survive crossing. This is the story of how he got onto that ship in the first place, what actually happened once he found the land he was looking for, and what his voyages set loose upon the world. A story with genuine adventure and genuine ambition running through it, but also, and just as importantly, genuine cruelty that the more romantic tellings of this story have spent centuries quietly leaving out. Let the ship rock gently beneath you as we go, and let yourself drift, the way sailors on a long, uneventful watch eventually always do, somewhere between waking and sleep. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Fell in Love with the Edge of the Map. Christopher Columbus was born in the Italian port city of Genoa sometime around 1451, the son of a wool weaver, a trade that offered a respectable but entirely unremarkable path through life, one that involved no ships, no oceans, and certainly dreams of reaching the far side of the world. It was not, by any reasonable expectation, a childhood that should have produced one of history's most famous navigators. But Genoa itself was not an ordinary city. It was one of the great maritime trading powers of the Mediterranean, its harbor filled constantly with ships arriving from and departing toward every corner of the known world, its merchants trading in silk and spices that had traveled unimaginable distances over land and sea from Asia before ever reaching a Genoese warehouse. Growing up in the middle of this constant maritime traffic, young Columbus developed an early, genuine fascination with the sea that pulled him steadily away from his father's wool trade and toward the docks instead. He went to sea for the first time as a teenager, and the details of his earliest voyages remained frustratingly thin, pieced together from fragments and later, sometimes self-serving accounts he wrote himself once he'd become famous enough for his early life to matter to anyone. What is clear is that he survived, in these early years, at least one genuinely dramatic shipwreck, an experience that would have killed a great many sailors, and that seems, if anything, to have only deepened rather than diminished his appetite for the sea. By his mid-20s, Columbus had settled for a time in Portugal, which was, at this exact moment in history, the single most advanced maritime power in the entire world, its navigators pushing steadily further down the coast of Africa in careful, incremental voyages, searching for a sea route around the continent that would allow Portuguese ships to reach the fabled riches of Asia directly, without relying on the long, expensive overland trade routes controlled by Middle Eastern and Central Asian merchants along the way. It was here, surrounded by the most sophisticated navigational knowledge available anywhere on Earth, that Columbus began developing the obsession that would consume the rest of his life. He pored over maps, read accounts of earlier travelers to Asia, studied the available scientific and geographic knowledge of his day with genuine, if sometimes selective, intensity. And out of all of this study, he arrived at an idea that would eventually change the world. An idea that was bold, genuinely original in its practical ambition, and win one absolutely crucial respect that almost nobody realized until it was far too late to matter. Significantly, dangerously wrong. Chapter 2. The idea that nearly everyone told him was impossible. Here is something worth clearing up directly, because popular memory has gotten it badly wrong for generations. The educated scholars and navigators who rejected Columbus's proposal did not reject it because they thought the Earth was flat. By the late 15th century, among the people whose opinion actually mattered for funding a transatlantic voyage, the spherical shape of the Earth was not seriously in dispute at all. Ancient Greek scholars had calculated the Earth's circumference with real, impressive accuracy many centuries earlier, and that knowledge had never entirely disappeared. What Columbus's critics actually objected to was something far more specific and far more mathematically sound. They believed, correctly, that Columbus had drastically underestimated the actual distance a ship would need to sail westward to reach Asia. Columbus, drawing on a combination of flawed ancient sources, his own selective reading, and what appears to have been a fair amount of simple wishful thinking, had convinced himself that the distance from Europe to Asia, sailing west, was something in the range of a few thousand miles. A genuinely survivable voyage for the ships and provisioning available in his era. The scholars who reviewed his proposal, using more accurate calculations of the Earth's actual size, correctly concluded that the real distance was vastly greater. So great, in fact, that no ship of the era, carrying the food and fresh water a crew would need, could possibly survive the crossing before running out of supplies entirely. By their calculations, Columbus's plan wasn't bold. It was a recipe for a slow, entirely preventable death at sea, and rejecting his proposal was, from a purely scientific standpoint, the correct and responsible decision. What none of these careful, mathematically sound scholars knew, and what Columbus himself had no way of knowing either, was that an entire continent, 2 continents in fact, along with everything and everyone living on them, sat directly in the path of his proposed westward route, close enough that a ship might actually reach land before its supplies gave out, even though that land was nothing remotely like the Asia Columbus was actually trying to reach. Columbus, in other words, was wrong about almost everything that mattered to his own theory, and he was about to become spectacularly, historically famous precisely because of an accident of geography that his own calculations had never accounted for at all. He didn't know any of this yet, of course. All he knew as he began shopping his proposal around the royal courts of Europe was that he was absolutely, unshakably convinced he was right, and that everyone telling him otherwise simply lacked the vision to see what he saw. Chapter 3. Rejected. Again and again and again. It would take Columbus the better part of a decade and a truly remarkable amount of stubborn persistence before anyone with the resources to fund an actual voyage took his proposal seriously, and the sheer number of times he was turned down along the way is worth sitting with, because it tells you something important about exactly what kind of man was about to become one of the most consequential figures in world history. He approached the Portuguese crown first, the most logical choice given his years living in Portugal and his familiarity with its advanced maritime establishment. Portuguese scholars reviewed his proposal with real seriousness and, applying the more accurate geographic calculations already discussed, rejected it as fundamentally unworkable. Portugal, in any case, had its own steadily advancing plan already underway. the careful, methodical route around the southern tip of Africa, and had little appetite for gambling resources on an untested rival scheme from a foreign sailor with an unproven theory. Undeterred, Columbus took his proposal elsewhere and elsewhere and elsewhere again. He approached the English crown. He approached the French crown. Each time, the response followed a broadly similar pattern. Polite or not so polite skepticism from the scholars and advisors tasked with evaluating his mathematics, and ultimately, a rejection of the funding he needed to actually put his theory to the test. By the time he arrived in Spain to make his case to the newly united crowns of Castile and Aragon, ruled jointly by Isabella and Ferdinand, Columbus had already spent years being told by the most qualified experts available in Europe that his fundamental premise was mistaken. A less stubborn man might reasonably have concluded at this point that the experts had a point. Columbus did not conclude this. If anything, each rejection seems to have hardened his conviction rather than shaken it, and he spent years at the Spanish court patiently and repeatedly making his case, forming relationships with sympathetic advisors and clergy who found his ambition genuinely compelling even as the Crown's own scholarly advisory panel continued, correctly, to point out the fundamental mathematical problems with his plan. It would take one crucial, unrelated historical event, a war finally reaching its conclusion after nearly 8 centuries, before Columbus's persistence would finally, improbably, pay off, and before Isabella and Ferdinand would find themselves, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the actual merits of his proposal, suddenly willing to take a chance on the stubborn Genoese sailor who simply refused to stop asking. Chapter 4. A queen flush with victory takes a gamble. In January of 1492, after a military campaign that had consumed the better part of a decade, the combined forces of Isabella and Ferdinand completed the conquest of Granada, the last remaining Muslim-ruled territory on the Iberian Peninsula, bringing to a close a centuries-long process of Christian reconquest that had defined Spanish politics for generations. The victory left the newly unified Spanish crown flush with confidence, prestige, and, crucially for Columbus's purposes, a genuine appetite for new ventures that might further enhance Spain's standing against its great regional rival, Portugal. Columbus, who had continued patiently pressing his case even through the final tense months of the Granada campaign, found the political climate suddenly, unexpectedly favorable. With the immediate military priority resolved, and with Portugal's own maritime ambitions continuing to advance along the African coast, Isabella and Ferdinand found themselves newly receptive to a proposal that might, if it somehow succeeded, give Spain a genuine competitive advantage in the increasingly important race to reach Asia by sea. The negotiations that followed reveal a great deal about Columbus's genuine, unshakable self-confidence. He did not simply ask for funding. He demanded as the price of his services an extraordinary set of titles and privileges should his voyage succeed. The hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the position of Viceroy over any lands he discovered, and a substantial percentage of any wealth extracted from those lands, terms that a man with genuine doubts about his own theory's soundness would hardly have dared to demand. Remarkably, after some initial hesitation and at least one moment where negotiations reportedly broke down entirely before being hastily revived, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed to Columbus's terms, formalized in an agreement known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. It represented, from the Crown's perspective, a genuinely modest financial gamble against the possibility of an enormous strategic and economic payoff, and from Columbus's perspective, the validation of nearly a decade of relentless, repeatedly rejected persistence. He was given command of 3 ships, a modest budget, and the authority to recruit a crew, though recruiting that crew, as it turned out, would prove considerably harder than securing royal approval had been, since word had spread among the actual working sailors of Spain's Atlantic ports that this particular voyage was widely regarded as a suicidal gamble that no experienced seaman with any other option would willingly sign up for. Chapter 5. 3 small ships and a crew. Nobody else wanted assembling a crew willing to sail into open ocean with no confirmed destination, on a voyage the most knowledgeable navigators in Europe had already declared mathematically impossible, proved to be one of the most immediate and practical obstacles standing between Columbus and his departure. The 3 ships eventually assembled for the voyage, the Santa María, serving as Columbus's flagship, along with the smaller Pinta and Niña, were modest vessels by any standard, none of them large enough to carry the kind of extensive supplies a truly long voyage would require, a detail that made the crew's eventual willingness to board them even more remarkable given what they'd been told about the voyage's genuine risks. Recruitment proved difficult enough that, in at least the port town of Palos, from which the expedition ultimately departed, royal authorities resorted to offering pardons to men facing criminal charges in exchange for their willingness to join the crew, a detail that tells you a great deal about exactly how desperate the recruitment effort had become, and exactly how few experienced, willing volunteers were available for a voyage this widely regarded as reckless. Alongside these reluctant conscripts and pardoned prisoners, Columbus did manage to recruit a meaningful number of genuinely skilled and experienced sailors, drawn by a combination of decent pay, the personal persuasion of Columbus himself, and, for at least some among them, a genuine sense of adventure and curiosity about what might actually lie across the ocean, whatever the official scholarly consensus said about the impossibility of the journey. The full expedition across all three ships numbered somewhere around 90 men, a genuinely small force to be entrusted with a voyage of this scale in consequence, packed tightly into vessels that offered minimal comfort, minimal privacy, and, as the voyage would soon reveal, an uncomfortably finite supply of food and fresh water for a journey whose actual length remained, even to its own captain, a matter of considerable and dangerous uncertainty. On the 3rd of August, 1492, the three ships finally departed from the Spanish port of Palos, carrying Columbus, his hastily assembled crew, and the full weight of nearly a decade of stubborn persistence, out into the Atlantic Ocean and toward a destination that existed, at this exact moment, only in the confident, mistaken calculations of a wool weaver's son who was about to discover just how wrong, and just how consequentially wrong, those calculations actually were. Chapter 6. The voyage turns, and the crew begins to turn on him. The first leg of the voyage, down to the Canary Islands off the northwest coast of Africa for final resupply and repairs, passed without major incident, giving the crew little indication of just how difficult the true open ocean crossing that followed was about to become. Once the ships left the Canaries behind and struck out directly westward into open, uncharted ocean, the genuine psychological pressure of the voyage began to mount with real and mounting intensity. Day after day, the ships sailed on into empty water with no landmark, no familiar coastline, nothing at all to mark their progress beyond Columbus's own calculations. Calculations that, as we've already established, significantly underestimated the true distance still remaining before land of any kind would appear. Columbus, aware of just how unsettling this endless, featureless voyage was proving for his crew, made a deliberate and calculated decision that reveals a great deal about his particular blend of ambition and manipulation. He began keeping 2 separate logs of the distance traveled each day, an accurate one for his own private reference, and a deliberately understated one that he shared with his increasingly anxious crew, hoping that underselling the true distance already covered would keep morale from collapsing entirely as the voyage stretched on far longer than most of the men had anticipated. It worked, for a time. But by early October, more than a month into the crossing with still no confirmed sign of land, even Columbus's carefully managed morale began to fray badly. Sailors began openly questioning whether they would ever see land again, whether their food and water would hold out for a return journey even if they turned back immediately, and whether their captain's stubborn confidence was leading them toward a slow, entirely avoidable death somewhere in the middle of an ocean that might genuinely have no far side at all. By some accounts, tensions reached a genuine crisis point, with serious discussion among at least some of the crew about the possibility of mutiny, forcing Columbus to turn back, or worse, simply removing him from command entirely and making the decision themselves. Columbus, whatever else can be said about his judgment and his morality, proved remarkably effective in this exact crisis moment, reportedly negotiating a specific time frame with his most anxious officers, a small handful of additional days to find land, after which, if nothing appeared, he would agree to turn the ships around and abandon the voyage entirely. It was an enormous gamble layered on top of an already enormous gamble, and as the agreed deadline drew closer with still no land in sight, Columbus and his entire expedition found themselves teetering on the very edge of complete and total failure, a failure that would have erased this entire voyage from history as nothing more than a footnote about one more overconfident sailor who never returned. And then, in the very final hours before that deadline arrived, something changed. Chapter 7. land. But whose discovery was it, really? In the early hours of October 12, 1492, a sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana spotted something on the distant horizon that every single exhausted, anxious man aboard these 3 ships had been desperately hoping to see for weeks: land. The moment should have belonged, by any reasonable measure, to Rodrigo de Triana himself, the ordinary sailor whose sharp eyes in the pre-dawn darkness had finally ended weeks of mounting dread and uncertainty. The Spanish crown had, before the voyage departed, promised a substantial lifetime pension to whichever crew member first sighted land, a genuinely meaningful reward for an ordinary sailor of modest means. But Columbus, according to several historical accounts, later claims the reward for himself, asserting that he had actually spotted a distant, flickering light on the horizon some hours earlier than Rodrigo's confirmed sighting of the coastline itself, a claim that conveniently transferred the substantial promised reward from an ordinary sailor to the expedition's already well-compensated commander. Whether Columbus's claimed earlier sighting was genuine or a self-serving fabrication remains a matter of historical dispute, but the episode offers an early, telling glimpse of a pattern that would recur throughout Columbus's subsequent career: a consistent tendency to claim credit, reward, and recognition for himself, regardless of whose actual effort or actual discovery might have more rightfully deserved it. Whatever the truth of that particular dispute, the land itself was real, and by that same morning Columbus and his crew had made landfall on a small island in what we now call the Bahamas, an island Columbus promptly named San Salvador, claiming it, with the full ceremonial formality of the era, for the Spanish crown, a formal act of possession that gave no consideration whatsoever to the fact that this land was quite obviously already inhabited. For the exhausted, relieved crew, this moment represented the triumphant, almost unbelievable conclusion of a voyage that had, just days earlier, seemed genuinely likely to end in mutiny, starvation, or simple, quiet disappearance, somewhere in the vast Atlantic. For Columbus himself, it represented the vindication of nearly a decade of rejection and persistence. The moment when his stubborn, mathematically flawed theory finally appeared to have been proven correct. What none of them yet understood, what Columbus himself would go to his grave still refusing to fully accept, was that this land was not, in fact, any part of Asia at all. It was something else entirely, something that existed nowhere in any of the geographic knowledge available to 15th century Europe. And the people Columbus and his crew were about to encounter on its shores were about to have their entire world transformed in ways that were about to prove considerably more consequential and very often considerably more devastating than anything Columbus himself could have anticipated as he stepped onto that beach. Chapter 8. The people already living there. The people Columbus and his crew encountered on San Salvador and the surrounding islands were the Taino, an indigenous people who had lived across this region of the Caribbean for many centuries before any European ship had ever approached their shores. Columbus's own written account of these first encounters, preserved in the journal he kept throughout the voyage, reveals a genuinely striking and troubling mixture of impressions. He described the Taino people he met with real, apparent admiration for their physical appearance, their evident intelligence, and the genuine generosity with which they greeted these strange, unannounced visitors arriving on unfamiliar vessels from across an ocean the Taino had no reason to know existed. And in the very same passages, often within the same paragraph, Columbus recorded a starkly different kind of assessment, a calculating, predatory evaluation of exactly how easily these same people might be subdued, controlled, and put to work serving Spanish interests. This dual impulse, genuine, apparently sincere admiration existing side by side with an immediate calculating assessment of exploitability, would characterize the entire subsequent relationship between the Spanish expedition and the Taino people, and it offers a genuinely important insight into exactly how Columbus, and the broader European colonial project he was inaugurating, understood the people whose land they were now claiming as their own. The Taino themselves, understandably, approached these strange new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and caution, offering food, information, and in many documented instances, genuine hospitality and assistance to men who had just completed an exhausting, dangerous ocean crossing. They had no framework, of course, for understanding what this first contact actually represented. The opening act of a colonial encounter that would, within just a few decades, prove utterly catastrophic for their entire civilization. Columbus, moving between the various islands he encountered over the following weeks, continued recording detailed observations of the people, the landscape, and, with particular and increasing interest, any signs of the gold that had, alongside the promised riches of Asian trade, formed a significant part of his original motivation for the entire voyage. It was this growing, increasingly urgent interest in gold, more than anything else, that would come to define the entire subsequent trajectory of Spanish involvement in these islands, and that would set in motion consequences for the Taino people that Columbus, in these early, cautiously optimistic weeks of first contact, had given no real indication of anticipating. Chapter 9. A Shipwreck. On Christmas Eve. As Columbus's small expedition continued exploring the islands of the Caribbean through the final weeks of 1492, disaster struck in a form that would prove, in an unexpected way, genuinely consequential for the entire subsequent history of European colonization in the Americas. On the night of December 24th, 1492, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a coral reef off the coast of what is now Haiti. The ship's hull damaged badly enough that it quickly became clear the vessel could not be saved or continued in service. The wreck occurred, by most accounts, through a combination of simple exhaustion and inattention among the crew on watch that night, distracted, perhaps understandably, by the approaching Christmas holiday and by the general sense of relaxed confidence that had settled over the expedition following weeks of successful, largely peaceful exploration. With one of his 3 ships lost and no realistic way to carry his entire crew home aboard the 2 smaller remaining vessels, Columbus made a decision that would establish an important and, in retrospect, genuinely ominous precedent. Using timber salvaged from the wrecked Santa Maria, he ordered the construction of a small fort and settlement on the nearby coast, which he named La Navidad, in honor of the Christmas Eve wreck that had necessitated its construction. He left behind a garrison of 39 men, along with orders to continue searching for gold and to maintain good relations with the local Taino population, while Columbus himself, along with the bulk of his remaining crew, prepared to sail back to Spain aboard the Niña and Pinta to report his findings. La Navidad represented the very first European settlement established in the Americas since the far earlier, ultimately abandoned Norse settlements centuries before, a genuinely significant historical milestone, though Columbus himself, preoccupied with the more immediate practical challenge of getting his remaining ships safely home, likely had little sense in this moment of just how historically consequential this small, hastily constructed outpost would prove to be. What Columbus could not have known as he sailed away from La Navidad in early January of 1493 was what fate awaited the 39 men he'd left behind, and just how badly the relationship between these men and their Taino hosts was about to deteriorate in his absence. The optimistic, largely peaceful first contact that had characterized Columbus's own initial weeks in the Caribbean was, for the men remaining at La Navidad, about to take a considerably darker and more violent turn, one that Columbus would not discover the full details of until his return to these same shores less than a year later. Chapter 10. A Hero's Welcome. Built on a very small amount of gold, Columbus's return voyage to Spain, completed in March of 1493, transformed him almost overnight from an obscure, repeatedly rejected foreign sailor into one of the most celebrated men in the entire Spanish kingdom. His arrival triggered genuine, widespread public excitement, and Isabella and Ferdinand received him with considerable ceremony, formally confirming the titles and privileges promised in the original capitulations of Santa Fe. Columbus paraded through Spanish towns displaying the modest quantities of gold, along with a small number of captured Taino individuals and various exotic plants and animals he'd brought back as evidence of his successful voyage, presenting his achievement with a degree of confidence and self-promotion that considerably exaggerated the actual, still quite limited material wealth his expedition had genuinely secured. It's worth pausing directly on the presence of these captured Taino individuals among the evidence Columbus paraded before the Spanish court, because it represents an early, stark example of exactly how the people of these newly encountered islands were about to be treated by the colonial project Columbus's voyage had just inaugurated, not as sovereign peoples with their own legitimate claim to their own land, but as curiosities, as evidence, and with increasing explicitness as the years went on, as a labor resource to be exploited for Spanish economic benefit. the actual gold Columbus had brought back, while enough to generate genuine excitement and enough to secure continued royal support for further expeditions, fell considerably short of the transformative riches that had originally motivated Isabella and Ferdinand's investment in his voyage. Columbus, aware of this gap between promise and reality, worked hard to manage the narrative, emphasizing the genuine scale of the lands he'd encountered and the strong likelihood, in his own confident telling, that far greater riches awaited further exploration and, crucially, further Spanish settlement and control. This initial triumphant return set the pattern that would characterize Columbus's entire subsequent career, genuine, remarkable achievement in terms of pure navigational and exploratory ambition, wrapped around an increasingly desperate and increasingly dishonest effort to make the practical, material results of that achievement match the extraordinary promises Columbus had made in order to secure royal backing in the first place. A gap between promise and reality that would only widen, with increasingly serious consequences, across the several additional voyages that come throughout Chapter 11. The Second Voyage, and the fort that no longer existed, buoyed by his triumphant reception and the considerable new resources now placed at his disposal. Columbus departed on a second voyage in September of 1493, commanding a vastly larger expedition than his original 3 modest ships. 17 vessels in total, carrying over 1,000 men, along with livestock, seeds, and equipment intended to establish permanent Spanish settlement across the islands he'd claimed the previous year. This expedition's character differed fundamentally from the first, where Columbus's original voyage had been, at its core, an exploratory venture. This second expedition was explicitly a colonizing force, intended to establish lasting Spanish control and extraction of resources from these newly claimed territories. The men who joined this expedition came with expectations of gold, land, and the kind of rapid personal enrichment that Columbus's triumphant return had helped fuel across Spanish society. Upon arriving back at La Navidad, where Columbus had left 39 men the previous winter, the expedition discovered a genuinely grim scene. The fort had been destroyed, and every single man Columbus had left behind was dead. Investigations suggested that the Spanish garrison, in Columbus's absence, had committed serious abuses against the local Taino population, seizing gold, women, and provisions through force and threat, provoking a Taino counterattack that had wiped out the entire settlement in apparent retaliation. This discovery marked a genuine turning point in the relationship between the Spanish and the Taino people, where Columbus's original first contact had been characterized by cautious, largely peaceful curiosity on both sides. The destruction of La Navidad and the Spanish response to it set in motion a cycle of violence and retaliation that would only intensify across the following years. Columbus, rather than reflecting critically on what his own men's behavior might have provoked, responded to the destruction of La Navidad with increasingly aggressive military action against the Taino population, establishing a pattern of forceful subjugation that would come to define Spanish rule across these islands for decades to follow. The optimistic, exploratory spirit of Columbus's first voyage was, from this point forward, replaced by something considerably darker, a colonial project increasingly organized around the forceful extraction of gold and labor from an indigenous population that had, within the space of barely a single year, gone from cautious, curious hosts to a subjugated people facing escalating violence, forced labor, and though none of them could have anticipated it yet, a demographic catastrophe that would prove within just a few decades to be one that once. Chapter 12. When gold became an obligation enforced by mutilation. As Spanish settlement across the Caribbean islands expanded through the 1490s, the relationship between the colonizers and the Taino population evolved into something genuinely brutal, organized increasingly around a system of forced tribute and forced labor that historians have documented in considerable and disturbing detail. Columbus, seeking to satisfy the Spanish crown's continued demand for a return on its investment, implemented a system requiring Taino individuals over a certain age to deliver a specific quota of gold or spun cotton to Spanish authorities at regular intervals. This system placed an impossible burden on a population living in regions where accessible gold deposits were, in reality, quite limited. and the punishments imposed on those who failed to meet their assigned quota were, according to multiple documented historical accounts, genuinely severe, including, in a substantial number of recorded cases, the amputation of hands as punishment for failing to deliver the required tribute. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest and chronicler who lived through and documented much of this era, provided detailed, first-hand accounts of the brutality inflicted on the Taino population under this system, describing forced labor conditions, physical punishment, and killing on a scale that he himself, writing as a contemporary witness rather than a modern historian looking back, described as genuinely catastrophic and genuinely shameful. His accounts, while later scrutinized and debated by historians regarding certain specific details and numbers, remain a crucial and largely corroborated primary source for understanding just how severe and systematic this violence actually became. Alongside this forced tribute system, Spanish colonizers increasingly relied on outright forced labor, compelling Taino individuals to work in gold mining and agricultural production under conditions that combined grueling physical demands with inadequate food and frequent violent punishment. This forced labor system, sometimes referred to by the term encomienda, effectively reduced much of the Taino population to a condition of brutal servitude within just a few years of first contact. A stunningly rapid transformation from the cautiously hospitable hosts Columbus had described in his earliest journal entries. Columbus himself, as the appointed governor and viceroy of these territories, bore direct administrative responsibility for this system and its brutal enforcement, a responsibility that later formal Spanish investigations into his conduct would specifically and explicitly address, finding him culpable for abuses that even by the standards of his own often brutal era were judged to have crossed genuine and serious lines, a judgment that would, within just a few more years, concrive it directly to consequential. Chapter 13, The Killer Nobody Could See, even as the forced labor and violent punishment already described took a severe and mounting toll on the Taino population. An entirely different and, in the longer term, even more devastating threat was spreading through these same communities, one that neither the Spanish colonizers nor the Taino themselves fully understood at the time, and that neither side could have prevented even had they understood it: European diseases. Smallpox, chief among them, alongside measles, influenzas, and several others, had circulated through European and broader Old World populations for many centuries, leaving surviving populations with at least some accumulated immunity built up over countless generations of prior exposure. The Taino population of the Caribbean, and indeed the indigenous populations across the entire Americas, had never previously encountered these specific pathogens and possessed essentially no immunity whatsoever to protect them. The result, once these diseases were introduced through ongoing contact with Spanish sailors, soldiers, and settlers, was a demographic catastrophe of a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend even now, with the benefit of centuries of subsequent historical and epidemiological study. Disease spread through Taino communities with devastating speed and lethality, killing enormous percentages of the population within just a few years of sustained contact. A toll that, when combined with the forced labor, violence, and social disruption already inflicted by Spanish colonization, produced a population collapse among the Taino people of the Caribbean that historians now regard as one of the most severe and rapid demographic catastrophes in all of recorded human history. This particular tragedy carries a genuinely important and often misunderstood distinction worth stating clearly. Unlike the deliberate violence, forced labor, and mutilation already described, the spread of these diseases was not, for the most part, a deliberate weapon consciously wielded by Spanish colonizers, at least not in this earliest period of contact. It was, instead, an unintentional but no less catastrophic consequence of two previously isolated populations coming into sustained contact for the very first time in human history, a biological reality that neither Columbus nor the Taino people he encountered possessed the scientific understanding to anticipate or prevent. This does not, in any way, diminish the deliberate cruelty and violence that Columbus's administration inflicted directly and knowingly upon the Taino population, which stands as its own separate and serious historical crime. But understanding the additional, unintentional catastrophe of disease helps explain just how total and how rapid the devastation of Caribbean indigenous populations actually was in these first decades of European contact. a combination of deliberate violence and unintentional biological catastrophe that, together, brought the Taino people within the span of just a few decades to the very brink of complete extinction as a distinct and independent people. Chapter 14. The governor who could not govern beyond the severe humanitarian catastrophe already described. Columbus's actual performance as the appointed administrator of Spain's new Caribbean territories proved, by nearly every practical measure available to historians studying the period, genuinely poor, a failure that would ultimately prove just as consequential to his personal fate as the atrocities committed under his authority. Spanish colonists who had traveled to the Caribbean expecting rapid personal enrichment found themselves instead facing genuine hardship, disease, and considerably less easily accessible gold than Columbus's enthusiastic earlier promises had led them to expect. Discontent among these colonists grew steadily, fueled by Columbus's evident administrative inexperience, by accusations of favoritism toward his own family members, whom he'd appointed to several key positions of authority within the colonial government, and by a general sense among the settlers that Columbus, whatever his genuine skill as a navigator, simply lacked the administrative competence necessary to govern an increasing necropolic colonial territory. These grievances eventually reached the Spanish crown directly through formal complaints and petitions from colonists who had grown genuinely disillusioned with conditions in the territories Columbus governed. Isabella and Ferdinand receiving mounting evidence of administrative dysfunction, financial irregularity, and increasingly genuine brutality in Columbus's treatment of both the indigenous population and, in some documented instances, Spanish colonists themselves who ran afoul of his authority, grew steadily more concerned about the situation developing under his governance. Columbus, for his part, seems to have responded to this mounting criticism with a combination of genuine bewilderment and defensive self-justification, apparently unable or unwilling to recognize the legitimate substance behind at least some of the complaints being lodged against him. His correspondence from this period reveals a man increasingly consumed by grievance and suspicion, convinced that jealous rivals and ungrateful subordinates were conspiring against him rather than acknowledging any genuine failure in his own administrative judgment or conduct. This mounting crisis of governance, layered on top of the already severe humanitarian catastrophe unfolding under his authority, was building toward a genuine reckoning, one that would arrive with considerable and humiliating force in the form of a royal investigator dispatched directly from Spain with authority that Columbus, despite his grand titles and his considerable navigational fame, would ultimately prove powerless to resist. Chapter 15. The tools that made an impossible crossing merely extremely dangerous. Before continuing the story of Columbus's mounting troubles as governor, it's worth pausing to understand exactly how a 15th century sailor navigated an open ocean crossing with no landmarks at all, because the tools available to Columbus and his crew were, by modern standards, remarkably primitive, and understanding their limitations makes the whole voyage feel considerably more perilous than a simple recounting of the journey's outcome might suggest. The primary navigational method available to Columbus was something sailors called dead reckoning, a technique that involved carefully tracking a ship's speed, its heading, and the time elapsed since the last known position, then using that accumulated data to calculate, through fairly straightforward but genuinely error-prone arithmetic, roughly where the ship ought to currently be. Speed itself was measured through remarkably crude methods, often involving little more than tossing a floating object off the bow and timing, with an hourglass, how long it took to pass the length of the ship, a measurement technique that introduced real, unavoidable imprecision into every single calculation that followed from it. Compasses, using magnetized needles to indicate magnetic north, had been in use by European sailors for a couple of centuries by Columbus's time, and provided a genuinely reliable way to maintain a consistent heading across open water where no landmarks existed to steer by. But even compass technology of this era carried limitations that modern navigators would find genuinely alarming, including a systematic deviation between magnetic north and true north that varied by location in ways 15th century navigators understood only imperfectly. Instruments like the quadrant and, somewhat later, the astrolabe allowed sailors to measure the angle of the sun or particular stars above the horizon, providing a method for estimating latitude, how far north or south a ship had traveled, with reasonable if imperfect accuracy. Determining longitude, by contrast, how far east or west a ship had traveled, remained an essentially unsolved navigational problem that would not find a genuinely reliable solution for centuries after Columbus's voyages, meaning that dead reckoning, with all its accumulated imprecision, remained the primary method available for tracking a ship's actual progress across an open ocean crossing. Given all of this, it's worth appreciating just how much of Columbus's eventual success depended on a combination of skilled seamanship, reasonable estimation, and, crucially, given how badly his underlying theory about the distance to Asia had miscalculated the true scale of the crossing, the sheer geographic accident of land actually existing where his flawed calculations happened to place it. A slightly different, slightly more accurate set of calculations, ironically, might well have discouraged Columbus from attempting the voyage at all, or might have led him to provision his ships for a genuinely survivable crossing of the true distance to Asia, an amount of food and water that would have proven wildly, fatally excessive for the considerably shorter distance to land that his voyage, thanks entirely to accident rather than accuracy, actually required. Chapter 16. A third voyage and a continent he still refused to recognize following the difficult, increasingly troubled years of colonial administration already described. Columbus departed on a third voyage in 1498, this time with explicit instructions to continue exploring further south and west from the islands already claimed, in continued pursuit of the passage to mainland Asia that Columbus remained convinced must lie somewhere within reach. This third voyage brought Columbus and his ships into contact with the South American mainland for the first time, sailing along the coast of what is now Venezuela and encountering the substantial outflow of the Orinoco River, a river whose sheer scale and freshwater volume gave Columbus his first genuine moment of doubt about his own long-held theory. A river of this size and force, he reasoned in his own written accounts from the voyage, could only originate from an enormous landmass, considerably larger than any island, and inconsistent with the geography he had long assumed applied to the outer edges of Asia. For a brief, genuinely remarkable moment, Columbus's own observations pushed him toward a conclusion that, had he fully embraced it, would have represented a significant and historically important admission that he had encountered not the edges of Asia at all, but some entirely separate, previously unknown landmass. Columbus, characteristically, stopped short of fully accepting this implication, instead constructing an elaborate alternative theory suggesting that this newly encountered land might represent the biblical location of earthly paradise, a genuinely striking example of how far Columbus's reasoning would stretch in order to preserve his original, foundational conviction about having reached Asia rather than confronting the increasingly obvious alternative explanation. While Columbus continued this exploration of the South American coastline, conditions back in the Caribbean colonies he nominally still governed continued deteriorating badly, with the accumulated grievances of colonists and the mounting evidence of administrative dysfunction and brutality toward the indigenous population reaching a genuine crisis point during his extended absence exploring the mainland coast. By the time Columbus returned to the main colonial settlement, he found conditions in genuine disarray, colonial authority badly undermined by his prolonged absence and by the accumulated failures of the subordinate administrators he had left in charge. It was this deteriorating situation, building throughout the course of Columbus's third voyage, and reaching a genuine crisis by the time of his return, that would finally prompt the Spanish crown to dispatch the royal investigator, whose arrival and whose subsequent decision to have Columbus arrested and returned home in chains we've already described, a humiliating conclusion to a voyage that had begun with Columbus tantalizingly, briefly close to recognizing the true and staggering scale of exactly what he had actually discovered. Chapter 17. The men who sailed beside him, and what became of them. Christopher Columbus rarely receives credit, in the popular telling of this story, for sharing his voyage with other genuinely skilled and consequential sailors, men whose own contributions to the expedition's success, and whose own subsequent fates, deserve to be remembered alongside Columbus's own more famous story. Martin Alonso Pinzon, an experienced and well-respected sailor from the port town of Palos, commanded the Pinta throughout the original 1492 voyage, and by many historical accounts, played a genuinely crucial role in recruiting the reluctant crew members needed to staff Columbus's expedition in the first place, using his own considerable local reputation and connections to convince skeptical local sailors to sign on for a voyage most of them privately believed was reckless folly. Pinzon's own navigational judgment proved significant during the voyage itself, and some historical accounts suggest meaningful tension between Pinzon and Columbus over navigational decisions and, following their landfall, over the proper division of credit and reward for the voyage's success. This tension escalated seriously during the return voyage to Spain, when a storm separated the Pinta from Columbus's remaining ships, and Pinzon, reaching Spain slightly ahead of Columbus, apparently attempted to reach the royal court first and claim a share of the credit and reward for the expedition's success, independent of Columbus's own account. Pinzon, however, fell seriously ill shortly after returning to Spain and died within just a few weeks of the voyage's conclusion, never living to see how the credit and reward for this consequential voyage would ultimately be distributed, and never receiving anything close to the recognition that Columbus himself would go on to enjoy, at least for the following several years of his life. Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, Martín Alonso's younger brother, commanded the smaller Niña throughout the original voyage, and went on to a long and genuinely distinguished subsequent career as an explorer in his own right, later commanding his own expeditions that reached the coast of Brazil and explored significant portions of the South American coastline, achievements that, while genuinely significant in their own right, have been considerably overshadowed in popular historical memory by the greater fame attached to Columbus's own name. The ordinary sailors who made up the bulk of Columbus's original crew, the pardoned prisoners, the desperate men who'd found no other employment, and the smaller number of genuinely experienced and willing sailors who joined for pay or genuine curiosity, left behind, for the most part, no detailed individual historical record at all, their names and their subsequent fates lost to history in the way that ordinary participants impetusibly possible are, their collective essential contribution to this voyage. Evolve to trade. That's at the door to be off. Chapter 18. Who was Christopher Columbus really? Here's a detail about Columbus's story that surprises a great many people encountering it for the first time. The basic facts of his early life and origin, which this story has already recounted, rest on evidence that is, by the standards of rigorous modern historical scholarship, considerably less certain than the confident, straightforward biographical narrative might suggest. The traditional account, and the one supported by the majority of historical evidence and the overwhelming scholarly consensus, holds that Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451, the son of a wool weaver, exactly as this story has already described. This account draws on a range of surviving documentary evidence, including legal and financial records from Genoa that reference a Christopher Columbus matching the approximate details of the navigator's later life. However, largely because Columbus himself was notably and consistently evasive about the specific details of his own early life and origins throughout his adult career, a pattern that some historians have suggested reflects a degree of genuine social insecurity about his relatively humble origins as he moved through the aristocratic courts of Portugal and Spain. A number of alternative theories about his true origins have circulated over the centuries since his death, proposed by various historians and researchers who found the traditional Genoese account for various biscuits. These alternative theories have proposed origins ranging from various other Italian regions to Spain, Portugal, and even, in some of the more speculative and less widely accepted theories, a Jewish or converso background that Columbus might have had genuine reason to obscure, given the considerable religious persecution facing Jewish and recently converted communities in Spain during exactly this period, particularly following the establishment in India's Jewish population, which occurred, remarkably, in that very same consequential millions per cent. It's worth being genuinely careful and honest here. None of these alternative theories have achieved anything close to mainstream scholarly acceptance, and the traditional Genoese account remains by a considerable margin the version supported by the weight of available historical evidence. But the genuine scholarly debate that continues to surround even the most basic facts of Columbus's early life offers a fascinating reminder of just how much uncertainty persists at the edges of even the most famous, most thoroughly studied historical events. A reminder that history, however confidently it's sometimes presented, very often rests on evidence considerably more fragmentary and contested than popular storytelling generally acknowledges. Chapter 19. Arrested, chained, and sent home in disgrace. By 1500, the mounting complaints against Columbus's administration had grown serious enough that Isabella and Ferdinand dispatched a royal investigator named Francisco de Bobadilla to the Caribbean colonies, granting him sweeping authority to assess the situation and, if warranted, to take direct control of the colonial government entirely. Bobadilla's investigation, upon his arrival, uncovered conditions considerably worse than even the accumulated complaints back in Spain had suggested. Evidence of severe mismanagement, financial irregularity, and brutal treatment of both the indigenous population and Spanish colonists that convinced Bobadilla the situation demanded immediate and decisive action. In a dramatic and, for Columbus, genuinely humiliating turn of events, Bobadilla ordered Columbus arrested, placed in physical chains, and sent back to Spain to face formal judgment before the crown that had once celebrated him as one of the great heroes of the age. Columbus made the return voyage to Spain in 1500, not as the triumphant admiral of the ocean sea who had once paraded through Spanish streets to public acclaim, but as a prisoner, physically restrained, facing serious formal accusations regarding his conduct as governor. By some accounts, Columbus insisted on remaining in his chains even after officials aboard the ship offered to remove them, apparently determined to present himself before Isabella and Ferdinand in a manner calculated to maximize sympathy for his plight. A characteristically theatrical gesture from a man who had built his entire career on exactly this kind of dramatic, carefully managed self-presentation. Upon his arrival in Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, while ultimately ordering Columbus's release from physical imprisonment, made clear that his period of unchecked colonial authority had come to a definitive end. He was stripped of his governorship, though he retained, through considerable further legal wrangling that would continue for years, at least some of the financial and titular privileges originally promised under the capitulations of Santa Fe. This dramatic fall from grace marked a genuine turning point in Columbus's public standing and personal fortune. The man who had once been celebrated as the visionary who had opened an entire new world to Spanish ambition was now widely regarded, even by the crown that had once so enthusiastically backed him, as a man whose administrative failures and personal conduct had brought genuine shame to a colonial project that Spain nonetheless had every intention of continuing to pursue, just, from this point forward, under different and considerably more carefully supervised leadership. Chapter 20. One last desperate voyage. Remarkably, despite his dramatic fall from administrative authority, Columbus managed to secure royal permission for one final voyage. Departing in 152 with 4 ships and instructions to search for a westward sea passage through to the genuine riches of Asia that had originally motivated his entire life's ambition, an idea Columbus, even now, still refused to fully abandon. This 4th and final voyage proved in nearly every respect the most disastrous of his entire career. Columbus's ships encountered severe storms, and his request to shelter in the harbor of the very colony he had once governed was denied by the new Spanish administration now in charge there, forcing his battered fleet to weather dangerous conditions at sea that a safe harbor could easily have spared them. The voyage continued along the coast of Central America, searching in vain for the passage through to Asia that Columbus remained convinced must exist somewhere nearby, before deteriorating ship conditions and mounting difficulties eventually forced Columbus to abandon 2 of his 4 vessels entirely, continuing the expedition with his remaining 2 increasingly damaged ships until, in 53, both became so severely compromised by shipworm damage that they could no longer safely sail at all, forcing Columbus and his remaining crew to run the vessels aground on the coast of Jamaica, where they found them stranded with thank and the way. For nearly a full year, Columbus and his stranded crew survived in this precarious situation, their relationship with the local indigenous population growing increasingly strained as the crew's demands for food and supplies wore thin the initial hospitality they'd been offered. In a genuinely remarkable episode that reveals both Columbus's continued resourcefulness and the manipulative instincts that had characterized his entire career, Columbus, drawing on his own astronomical knowledge and a printed almanac he had aboard predicting an upcoming lunar eclipse, reportedly warned local leaders that his god would demonstrate displeasure at their reluctance to continue supplying food by darkening the moon. And when the predicted eclipse duly occurred exactly as Columbus had claimed it would, the resulting fear reportedly restored the flow of provisions that Columbus and Icaiid just survived. Even this desperate, stranded final chapter of Columbus's seafaring career included genuine internal conflict, with a portion of his own crew mutinying against his authority and attempting, unsuccessfully, to reach help independently. Columbus was finally rescued in 54, brought back to Spain in what would prove to be his final return from the ocean he had crossed, first with such stubborn confidence, and now, At the genuine end of his active seafaring life, in a state of physical exhaustion and diminished reputation that stood in stark, sobering contrast to the triumphant hero's welcome that had greeted his very first return, more than a full decade earlier. Chapter 21. A death without the glory he'd expected. Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in November of 1504, in poor health after decades of punishing ocean voyages, and found the political landscape that had once so enthusiastically backed his ambitions considerably changed from the one that had first sent him across the Atlantic 12 years earlier. Queen Isabella, his most consistent and most important royal patron throughout his entire career, died just weeks after his return, removing from his life the single figure most personally invested in honoring the grand promises made under the original capitulations of Santa Fe. Ferdinand, who survived his wife and continued ruling in his own right, proved considerably less inclined to honor Columbus's full original claims to titles, governance, and wealth, and Columbus spent much of his remaining life engaged in increasingly frustrated legal efforts to secure what he insisted the crown still owed him. He died on the 20th of May, 1506, in the Spanish city of Valladolid, a considerably more modest and considerably less celebrated end than the man who had once paraded through Spanish streets as the triumphant discoverer of a new world might reasonably have expected for himself. Remarkably, and in a detail that speaks volumes about his particular blend of stubborn conviction and genuine self-delusion, Columbus died still firmly believing that the lands he had encountered represented the outer edges of Asia, never accepting, even at the very end of his life, the increasingly obvious reality that he had in fact encountered something entirely unknown to prior European knowledge, an entire hemisphere that Europeans had never previously known existed at all. The full recognition of exactly what Columbus had actually found would come only gradually, over the years following his death, as further exploration by other navigators made increasingly clear that these newly encountered lands could not possibly be any part of Asia. Fittingly, and with a considerable irony that Columbus himself never lived to appreciate, the entire hemisphere would eventually take its name not from Columbus at all, but from Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian navigator whose own published accounts of these lands as a genuinely new, previously unknown continent gained wider circulation and acceptance among European mapmakers than Columbus's own insistent, increasingly untenable claims of having reached Asia. Columbiform continued pursuing his original claims to titles and wealth through Spanish courts for decades after his death. A prolonged legal battle that reflects just how significant and just how genuinely contested the rewards of his voyages had ultimately proven to be. Rewards that Columbus himself in the end died without ever fully receiving, and without ever fully understanding the true and staggering historical significance of exactly what he had actually quite. And Chapter 22. The legacy that still divides the world, more than 5 centuries after Columbus's death. The historical legacy of his voyages remains, appropriately and unavoidably, one of the most genuinely contested subjects in the entire study of world history, and understanding why requires holding 2 very different, equally true realities in mind at the same time. On one hand, Columbus's voyages triggered what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, an unprecedented transfer of plants, animals, technologies, and peoples between the eastern and western hemispheres that fundamentally and permanently reshaped agriculture, diet, and daily life across the entire world. Crops originating in the Americas, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and many others, transformed diets and, in some documented cases, directly enabled population growth across Europe, Africa, and Asia, becoming so thoroughly integrated into cuisines worldwide that many people today would be genuinely surprised to learn these foods originated in the Americas at all rather than in the regions now most closely associated with them. This exchange, in the broadest possible historical sense, represents one of the most consequential developments in the entire history of human civilization. On the other hand, and inseparably intertwined with this exchange, Columbus's voyages inaugurated a colonial project that brought genuine catastrophe to the indigenous peoples of the Americas on a scale that this story has already tried to convey honestly and without softening. The Taino people Columbus first encountered were, within just a few decades of first contact, brought to the very brink of complete extinction through a devastating combination of forced labor, violence, and disease, a pattern of colonization, conquest, and demographic collapse that would, in the decades and centuries following Columbus's own voyages, repeat itself across vast stretches of the Americas as other European powers followed the path Columbus had first opened. Modern historical assessment of Columbus himself has grown considerably more critical in recent decades than the largely celebratory narrative that dominated popular memory for much of the 5 centuries following his death. Increasing historical attention to the documented brutality of his administration and to the broader catastrophe his voyages set in motion for indigenous peoples across 2 continents has led to genuine and ongoing public debate over how, and indeed whether, Columbus should continue to be commemorated through statues, holidays, and other forms of public memory that are considerably less critical earlier established in his honor. This ongoing debate reflects something important about how history itself continues to be understood and re-examined over time. Columbus was, by any honest and complete accounting, both a genuinely remarkable navigator whose stubborn persistence achieved something of authentic historical significance, and a man directly and personally responsible for genuine, documented atrocities against people whose only offense was already living on land that Columbus's ambition, and the ambition of the crown that backed him, had decided belonged to someone else entirely. Neither truth cancels out the other, and any honest telling of his story, including this one, has to hold both of them clearly in view at once. Chapter 23. The world he sailed away from. It's worth pausing before continuing toward the end of this story to understand exactly what kind of Spain Columbus actually departed from in August of 1492, because the same year that produced his famous voyage also produced some of the most consequential and troubling events in all of Spanish history. Events that reveal a great deal about the broader world that made Columbus's entire expedition possible in the first place. Earlier that same year, as already mentioned, Isabella and Ferdinand had completed their conquest of Granada, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula and completing a process of religious and territorial consolidation that the Spanish crown regarded as a genuine triumph of Christian unity. This same year, however, also saw the crown issue a formal edict expelling Spain's entire Jewish population, a community that had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for well over 1,000 years, forcing tens of thousands of people to abandon homes, businesses, and communities their families had maintained for generations, under threat of severe punishment for anyone who remained and refused conversion to Christianity. This expulsion occurred within the broader context of the Spanish Inquisition, an ecclesiastical institution established some years earlier specifically to investigate and root out perceived heresy among recent converts to Christianity, an institution that had already by 1492 subjected a considerable number of Spanish subjects to investigation, torture, and execution based on suspicion of secretly maintaining prior religious practices. Columbus's own voyage departed directly into this charged and turbulent atmosphere, and some historians have noted the genuine, striking coincidence that the Spanish ports along Columbus's own departure route were, in these exact same weeks, filled with Jewish families being forcibly expelled from the only homeland many of them had ever known, their ships departing from many of the same harbors that Columbus's own small expedition was preparing to leave from, in pursuit of an entirely different kind of departure altogether. This broader historical context matters for understanding Columbus's voyage as more than an isolated act of individual ambition. It occurred within a Spain actively engaged in an aggressive project of religious and political consolidation, a crown newly flush with military victory and eager to extend its influence and its resources into new territory, and a broader European moment defined by increasing competition between rival powers for access to the wealth and prestige the control of new trade routes and new territories might provide. Columbus's voyage, in other words, was not simply one stubborn man's personal triumph against the odds. It was also a direct expression of the particular ambitions, anxieties, and appetites of the specific and turbulent historical moment that happened to produce it. Chapter 24. The rival racing toward the same prize. Understanding Columbus's voyage also requires understanding that he was not operating in isolation, chasing a prize that no one else particularly wanted. He was, in fact, one competitor in an intense and increasingly urgent international race, one where Portugal, Spain's great maritime rival, held a substantial and, in the end, ultimately more successful lead. Portugal had been methodically working its way down the African coastline for decades before Columbus ever proposed his westward alternative, driven by patient, incremental exploration under royal sponsorship that had already produced genuine, significant advances in navigational knowledge and technique. This patient Portuguese approach, which Columbus's own more dramatic westward gamble had explicitly represented an alternative to, was steadily approaching its own historic breakthrough even as Columbus struggled through his final years of frustrated colonial administration. In 1498, while Columbus himself was engaged in his difficult third voyage along the South American coastline, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama successfully completed a voyage around the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, reaching the actual coast of India by an eastward sea route and definitively proving that Portugal's patient, methodical approach had succeeded precisely where Columbus's dramatic westward gamble, whatever else it had achieved, had actually failed at its own original, stated objective. This achievement carried genuine, sobering significance for Columbus's own reputation and legacy, even though it occurred without dramatic public fanfare that might have directly confronted Columbus with the implications. Da Gama's successful voyage definitively demonstrated that a genuine sea route to Asia existed, and that Columbus's own confident claims about having reached the outer edges of that same Asia via his westward route were, by direct and undeniable comparison, simply untrue. The goods, the people, and the unmistakable evidence Da Gama brought back from genuine India bore no resemblance whatsoever to anything Columbus had encountered on his own voyages. This uncomfortable comparison likely contributed, at least in part, to the increasingly elaborate and increasingly strained theories Columbus continued constructing throughout his later voyages and his later life to explain away the mounting evidence that he had not, in fact, reached Asia at all. Da Gama, unlike Columbus, would return home to genuine, unambiguous triumph and lasting historical credit for having accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. A contrast that Columbus, increasingly consumed by his own legal battles and his own stubborn insistence on a version of events that the wider world was steadily, inexorably concluding simply wasn't true, would have found, had he permitted himself to fully absorb it, genuinely difficult to bear. Chapter 25. A mistake that outlived the man who made it among the many lasting consequences of Columbus's voyages. One of the most persistent and most quietly revealing is a simple linguistic error that has outlived Columbus himself by more than 5 centuries, and that continues, in ordinary everyday language, to shape how millions of people around the world refer to entire populations of indigenous peoples across 2 continents. Convinced, as we've already established at length, that he had reached the outer edges of Asia, Columbus referred to the indigenous peoples he encountered as Indians, a term derived directly from his mistaken belief that these islands represented some outlying portion of the East Indies he had originally set out to reach. This label, despite being founded on an error that became increasingly, undeniably clear within just a few decades of Columbus's own death, nonetheless persisted in common European usage, applied indiscriminately to the vastly diverse and entirely distinct indigenous peoples and civilizations spread across the entire length and breadth of 2 continents that had, in reality, nothing whatsoever to do with the actual Indian subcontinent Columbus had originally believed he was approaching. The persistence of this mistaken label offers a genuinely striking illustration of just how deeply and how permanently Columbus's original error embedded itself into the basic language and conceptual framework through which subsequent European colonization of the Americas would be understood and conducted. Indigenous peoples with entirely distinct languages, cultures, religious practices, and historical experiences, the Taino, the Aztec, the Inca, and countless hundreds of other distinct nations and peoples across 2 vast continents, found themselves grouped together under a single, mistaken European label that erased, in casual everyday usage, the genuine and considerable diversity of the actual peoples it was applied to. This linguistic legacy persists today in various forms across the Americas, even as many indigenous communities and increasing numbers of historians and educators have worked to promote more accurate and more respectful terminology that better reflects the genuine diversity and specific identity of individual indigenous nations and peoples, rather than continuing to rely on a label that originated, quite simply, from one confident, stubborn man's basic geographic mistake, made in the earliest, most excited days of an encounter he never fully understood, even at the venated of a Chapter 26. The voyage that finally finished what Columbus started it would take one final, genuinely extraordinary voyage, undertaken by a different navigator entirely, to finally and conclusively settle the question that Columbus himself had spent his entire later life refusing to accept: the true scale and shape of the world he had sailed into, and the genuine, complete separation between the Americas and the actual continent of Asia he had always insisted he'd reached. In 1519, more than a decade after Columbus's own death, a Portuguese navigator named Ferdinand Magellan, sailing this time under Spanish sponsorship, departed on an expedition intended to find a sea route around the southern tip of the Americas and onward across the Pacific Ocean to reach Asia by a genuinely complete westward route, the very achievement Columbus himself had always believed his own voyages had already accomplished. Magellan's expedition, over the course of a grueling multi-year voyage marked by genuine hardship, mutiny, and the navigator's own death partway through the journey in a violent conflict in the Philippines, ultimately achieved something Columbus himself never managed: a complete circumnavigation of the entire globe, definitively proving through the simple, undeniable fact of the ship's own continuous westward journey, eventually proving through the simple, undeniable fact of the ship's own continuous westward chord. This achievement, completed by the small number of surviving crew members who managed to return home after Magellan's own death, represents in many ways the true, final conclusion of the exact geographic question that had originally motivated Columbus's entire life's ambition. Proof, delivered nearly 3 decades after Columbus's entire life's ambition. Proof, delivered nearly 3 decades after Columbus's own first voyage, that the world was indeed round, exactly as 15th century scholars had already corrected the underscoothed. But at one to watch and how strands. Columbus, of course, did not live to see this final, conclusive answer to the question that had consumed his entire adult life. He died still convinced of his own version of events, spared, in a strange and genuinely poignant way, from ever having to confront the complete and total scale of exactly how wrong his foundational theory had actually been. Even as the voyages his own stubborn persistence had first set in motion continued, for decades after his death, to steadily and irreversibly reveal the true shape of a world considerably stranger than the confident, mistaken calculations that had originally sent him sailing off the edge of it. Chapter 26.5. What daily life actually felt like aboard these ships beyond the dramatic high points of discovery, mutiny, and shipwreck already described. It's worth understanding what the ordinary, unremarkable texture of daily life actually felt like for the 90-odd men crammed aboard Columbus's 3 small ships across the many weeks of open ocean crossing, because the sheer physical discomfort of this experience shaped everything else that happened during the voyage. Space aboard vessels of this size was extraordinarily limited, with crew members sleeping wherever they could find room, often directly on deck or in cramped, poorly ventilated holds below, with none of the private quarters or genuine personal space that even the most modest modern accommodations would provide. Privacy, in any meaningful sense, simply did not exist for the ordinary sailor who lived, worked, ate, and slept in constant, close proximity to dozens of other men for weeks at a stretch. Food aboard ship consisted primarily of hardtack, a dense, long-lasting biscuit that could survive weeks or months of storage without spoiling, but that required, in practice, careful inspection for the weevils and other pests that frequently infested it during long voyages, along with salted meat and fish that provided necessary protein but that grew increasingly unpalatable as the voyage wore on, and the salting process failed to fully prevent gradual spoilage. Fresh water, stored in wooden barrels, grew steadily less pleasant to drink as the weeks passed, developing a stagnant taste and, in the worst cases, visible contamination that crews learned to simply tolerate as an unavoidable feature of long-distance sea travel. Basic hygiene aboard ship was minimal by any modern standard, with limited fresh water available for washing and no meaningful sanitation facilities beyond the simplest, most exposed arrangements. Disease could spread readily in these cramped, unsanitary conditions, though Columbus's original 1492 voyage proved relatively fortunate in this specific respect, completing its crossing without the kind of severe disease outbreak that plagued many other long ocean voyages of this era. The psychological toll of this extended, cramped, monotonous existence, layered on top of the genuine physical discomfort already described, helps explain a great deal about the mounting tension and near mutiny that characterized the final weeks before land was finally sighted. Weeks of poor food, cramped quarters, and mounting uncertainty about whether the voyage's underlying premise was even correct in the first place would have worn down the morale and patience of even the most disciplined and experienced crew. And the fact that Columbus's largely inexperienced, partly conscripted crew held together as long as they did under these genuinely difficult physical conditions speaks to a combination of skilled leadership, sheer stubborn hope, and simple lack of any better alternative once the ships were already committed to open unrealistic possibility of an end. Chapter 27. The man whose name the world chose instead we've already mentioned briefly, that the two continents Columbus encountered would eventually take their name not from Columbus himself, but from another Italian navigator entirely. The story deserves a fuller telling because it offers one final, genuinely fitting irony to close out the story of Columbus's own complicated legacy. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine explorer and navigator, participated in several voyages to the coast of South America in the years immediately following Columbus's own initial expeditions, exploring considerable stretches of the South American coastline and, crucially, reaching a conclusion that Columbus himself, as already described, had come tantalizingly close to but ultimately refused to fully accept that these lands represented an entirely new and previously unknown continent, genuinely distinct from Asia rather than merely an Allied's Maeve Joe. Vespucci's own published accounts of his voyages, circulated fairly widely across Europe in the early years of the 16th century, presented this conclusion clearly and directly in a manner that resonated with European mapmakers and scholars who were, by this point, already growing increasingly skeptical of Columbus's own continued insistence that he had reached Asia. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, producing a new and influential world map incorporating this rapidly accumulating geographic knowledge, made the fateful decision to label these newly recognized continents using a Latinized feminine form of Vespucci's first name, America, crediting Vespucci, rather than Columbus, with the genuine conceptual breakthrough of recognizing this land as a distinct new continent rather than an already known part of Asia. This naming decision, once established on Waldseemüller's widely circulated and influential map, proved remarkably difficult to reverse, and the name America steadily gained acceptance across subsequent decades of European cartography, eventually becoming permanently and irreversibly attached to the two continents in question, despite Columbus's own far more famous and far more celebrated initial voyages having actually reached these shores considerably earlier than Vespucci's own subsequent expeditions. This outcome offers a genuinely fitting, almost poetic conclusion to the particular pattern that characterized so much of Columbus's own career. A pattern already glimpsed in the earlier dispute over credit for the very first sighting of land, in which Columbus's own genuine achievements were repeatedly complicated, undermined, or overshadowed by questions of credit, recognition, and reward that never quite resolved in his own favor, as cleanly or as permanently sane might once have suggested they would. He crossed the ocean first. He encountered the land first. And in the end, an entire hemisphere was named not for him, but for another man entirely, whose principal contribution had been simply the willingness to accept a geographic truth that Columbus himself, to the very end of his life, could never quite bring himself to fully acknowledge. Chapter 28. The floodgates Columbus opened, and could not close whatever the specific details of Columbus's own individual triumphs and failures. His voyage's most lasting and most consequential legacy lies not in his own personal story at all, but in what his initial breakthrough set loose across the following decades, a wave of subsequent European conquest and colonization that would prove, in scale and in brutality, considerably more severe than anything Columbus himself lived to direct. Within just a few decades of Columbus's own death, Spanish conquistadors following the path his voyagers had first opened achieved conquests of a scale and speed that even Columbus's own considerable ambition had never approached. Hernán Cortés led a small Spanish force to the conquest of the powerful and sophisticated Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico, a campaign completed within just a few years and achieved through a combination of superior weaponry, strategic alliance with rival indigenous states resentful of Aztec dominance, and, critically, the same devastating advantage of European disease that had already proven so catastrophic for the Taino population Columbus himself had encountered. Francisco Pizarro, following a broadly similar pattern, led the conquest of the vast and sophisticated Inca Empire in South America shortly afterward, again combining military force, strategic exploitation of internal political division, and the same catastrophic disease advantage to achieve a conquest of genuinely staggering scale and speed against a civilization that had developed entirely independently of European influence, one of the most sophisticated and extensive empires in the pre-modern world. These subsequent conquests, building directly and explicitly on the precedent Columbus's own voyages had first established, extended the same fundamental pattern already described in painful detail across this story. Forced labor, violent subjugation, and catastrophic disease, across an enormously larger geographic scale and against civilizations of a scale and sophistication considerably greater than the Taino communities Columbus himself had first encountered. The demographic catastrophe that began with the Taino population of the Caribbean would, within just a century of Columbus's own initial voyage, extend across the entirety of the Americas, reducing indigenous populations by a percentage that modern historians and demographers continue to study and debate, but that virtually all serious scholarship agrees represents one of the most severe and rapid population collapses in all of recorded human history. Columbus himself did not live to see the full scale of what his own stubborn, persistent ambition had ultimately set in motion. He died in 1506, more than a decade before Cortés would even begin his own famous campaign against the Aztec Empire, and more than 2 decades before Pizarro's own conquest of the Inca. But the essential pattern that these later, considerably larger conquests would follow to Maynes, Spine Ford vs and Echeristo in violent subjugation and catastrophic disease had already been fully and clearly established during Columbus's own lifetime in the considerably smaller but no less genuine tragedy of the Taino people, making Columbus's own voyages not merely as jaculi of a new world for European ambition to exploit, but the opening chapter of a chapter in Quafists, Batinjo and Ways, e Columbuses, its sent a sign waste, hedadris reduag weshwes to rubanagative fate vad jedashquadi. Chapter 29, The Face Nobody Actually Painted. Here's a final, genuinely surprising detail worth knowing before we close out this story. Despite Columbus's immense and enduring fame, no verified portrait of him painted from actual life during his own lifetime has ever been confirmed to survive. And this simple, striking gap has left an oddly appropriate uncertainty hanging over even the most basic visual question of what the man actually looked like. Every painting of Columbus that hangs in galleries and appears in textbooks today was created after his death, often by considerable decades or even centuries, based on second-hand descriptions, artistic imagination, and the particular idealized conventions each subsequent era wanted to project onto this famous historical figure. The result is a genuinely striking visual inconsistency across the historical record. Dozens of authoritative portraits of Columbus exist, painted across the following several centuries, and they frequently depict a man with meaningfully different facial features, different builds, and different general appearances, none of them verified against any confirmed contemporary likeness, because no such confirmed likeness exists at all. This absence stands in genuinely striking contrast to Columbus's own son, Hernando Colón, who took considerable and deliberate care to preserve and promote his father's legacy following his death, compiling an extensive biography drawing on his father's own papers, journals, and correspondence, along with his own personal recollections of accompanying Columbus on that difficult fourth and final voyage as a young boy. Hernando's biography, despite carrying an obvious and understandable bias toward presenting his father in the most favorable possible light, remains one of the single most important surviving sources for understanding the details of Columbus's own life and voyages, particularly for the events of that final, disastrous fourth voyage that Hernando himself witnessed firsthand as a child. Hernando also assembled over the course of his own life one of the most extensive private libraries in all of Europe, a collection specifically intended to preserve and organize the accumulated knowledge of his era for future generations, motivated in significant part by his own deep personal engagement with his father's legacy and his own evident belief in the fundamental importance of careful, thorough historical documentation, a value that, ironically, makes the simple absence of any verified contemporary of his father feel like a genuine. This missing portrait offers a fitting final image to hold on to as this story draws to its close. A man whose actual physical face has been lost entirely to history, by an ever-shifting parade of imagined likenesses, each one reflecting more about the particular era that painted it than about the actual, specific human being who once stood on the deck of a small, creaking ship, staring at an empty horizon, utterly convinced that land and Asia and glory lay just beyond it, ne'er weighed ninths of ice. Ad were one mic wink strat just starts to Chapter 30. One night, somewhere between two worlds. Let's imagine it once more, together, the way it might genuinely have felt. Not a list of historical facts now, but a single night, somewhere in the middle of that first impossible ocean crossing, lived through the eyes of an ordinary sailor whose name history never bothered to record. He's perhaps 20 years old, a young man who signed onto this voyage more out of desperate need for work than any genuine ambition for adventure or discovery. 6 weeks into the crossing, he lies awake in the cramped, creaking hold of the ship, listening to the water moving against the hull, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, his mind circling the same anxious question that has haunted every man aboard these 3 small ships for days now. What happens if their captain is wrong, and there is simply no land at all, anywhere ahead of them, only more ocean stretching on forever until their food and water finally run out entirely? He thinks of home, of a small village along the Spanish coast, but feels, at this exact moment, impossibly distant, separated from him, not merely by miles of open ocean, but by an entire world of certainty and safety that he fears he may never see again. He thinks of the captain, sleeping somewhere above him in considerably more comfortable quarters, a man whose stubborn confidence has led 90 lives this far into an ocean that no European ship has ever successfully crossed and returned from before. And then, somewhere in these restless, anxious hours before dawn, he hears something change in the rhythm of footsteps on the deck above him, a sudden urgency, voices rising with an excitement he hasn't heard from this crew in weeks. He climbs up from the hold, still uncertain, still afraid to hope, and finds his fellow sailors gathered at the rail, straining their eyes toward a horizon that, for the first time in over a month, holds something other than empty water, land. Actual, solid, undeniable land, dark against the pre-dawn sky, close enough now that there can be no more doubt at all. And in that single, overwhelming moment, every anxious night of this impossible voyage, every whispered conversation about mutiny and turning back, every fear that this entire enterprise might simply swallow them all into an endless, empty ocean, all of it dissolves, replaced by something closer to pure, disbelieving relief, and the genuine, world-altering realization that whatever this land actually is, wherever it actually leads, nothing about the world any of them understood when they first set sail from Spain is ever going to be quite the same. Chapter 31. The Man Who Never Knew Where He'd Actually Been. By now, you have a fuller picture of who Christopher Columbus actually was. Not the simplified, celebratory figure of old textbooks and grade school pageants, and not a simple villain either, but something considerably more complicated and considerably more complicated and considerably more human than either of those easy stories allows. He was, without question, a man of genuinely remarkable stubbornness and ambition, willing to endure a full decade of repeated rejection from nearly every royal court in Europe rather than abandon a theory that the most qualified scholars of his day had correctly identified as fundamentally flawed. That same stubborn persistence, when it finally found a willing patron in Isabella and Ferdinand, produced one of the most consequential voyages in the entire history of human civilization. Not because Columbus's theory was correct, but because of an accident of geography that placed an entire unknown hemisphere directly in the path of his mistaken calculations. He was also, without question, a man directly and personally responsible for genuine, documented brutality against the Taino people, whose land his voyages claimed for a crown that had no legitimate right to it, and whose administration, once granted real authority over these newly claimed territories, proved capable of forced labor, mutilation, and violence on a scale that even the often brutal standards of his own era eventually judged to have crossed a serious and genuine line. And he presided, whether through direct intention or catastrophic unintended consequence, over the beginning of a demographic collapse that brought an entire people to the very edge of complete extinction within the space of just a few decades. Both of these truths belong to the same man, inseparably, and any honest accounting of his life and his legacy has to hold them together rather than choosing, as popular memory has so often chosen across the centuries since his death, to emphasize one truth while quietly setting the other aside. He died believing he had reached the edges of Asia, never once accepting, until his very last breath, that he had actually done something considerably stranger and considerably more consequential, that he had, through a combination of stubborn ambition, flawed calculation, and sheer historical accident, permanently and irrevocably connected two halves of the world that had developed from many thousands of years in complete and total isolation from one another, setting in motion changes to agriculture, to disease, to trade, to power, and to trickery, Let the ship's creaking timbers fall quiet now. Let the ocean settle into stillness beneath a horizon that finally, after all these long centuries, holds no more mysteries left to discover, only the long, complicated, unfinished story of everything those first uncertain voyages actually set in motion, drifting on now, the way all such stories eventually do, into the quiet dark of sleep. And so, our voyage across the endless Atlantic comes quietly to an end. Tonight, we've listened to the creaking timbers beneath our feet, felt the endless rhythm of the waves, and shared the cramped quarters of sailors who crossed an ocean without knowing what awaited them beyond the horizon. History often remembers the discoveries and the famous names, but behind every voyage were ordinary crew members who endured hunger, storms, exhaustion, cramped living conditions, and months of uncertainty simply to keep the ships moving forward. As you settle a little deeper into your pillow, let the sound of the sea slowly fade into the distance. The sails grow still, the waves become gentle, the stars shine quietly above a calm ocean, and perhaps it's time for you to drift away as well. If sleep has already begun to find you, let it carry you gently into peaceful dreams. And if you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. There's no way you need to hurry. Thank you for spending part of your evening here on *The Sleepless Storyteller. Until next time, sleep well, rest deeply, and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.